Ancient biblical prophets wrote about the future. Today, theologians are poring over those scriptures with a firm belief that their prophecies are coming to pass. Journey now into the world of eschatology on Prophecy in the News with author and lecturer J.R. Church.
On the doorpost of every Jewish home, there is affixed a small container of Scripture. It is called the Mezuzah. This particular Mezuzah has a sheen. In fact, every Mezuzah has a sheen attached to it, the letter of the Hebrew alphabet standing for God, who is El Shaddai, the provider of those who live in that house. And inside this Mezuzah is a little scroll or a little paper with 22 lines of Scripture on it. These are profoundly mysterious. We're going to talk about this on today's Prophecy in the News. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me the mystery of the Mezuzah.
J.R., the mystery of the Mezuzah is rich and deep indeed. It's as rich as the history of Israel because literally the Jewish doorpost traces the history of that culture all around the world. And by the way, the Mezuzah also speaks of that future day when Israel will be regathered. 170 little words bound on a tiny little scroll, which J.R. held up a minute ago. I'll hold it up too. And these words come from Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, and from Deuteronomy 11, 13 through 21. The words in the first section are called the Shema. Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The second section begins, and it shall come to pass, if ye shall hearken diligently unto my commandments, speaking of the future of Israel, which is tied up around the concept of disobedience and obedience. And J.R., this Mezuzah then is more than just a little box. It literally speaks of the life of Israel. Deuteronomy 6:9 says, "And thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house, and on thy gates." That is the commandments of God. And in Hebrew, on the doorpost literally is al-mezuzot, speaking of the Mezuzah. It has the very same name as the doorpost. And so what it is a symbolic little doorpost that has some very special Scripture in it. Now I think as we go through the Mezuzah scroll, this tiny little scroll, you're going to see that God has pre-written Israeli history, and here it is on a tiny little paper. Now, we haven't told you about the richest part yet, because when we found out what I'm about to tell you, we became very excited. And what I'm about to tell you is this. These verses from Deuteronomy 6 and Deuteronomy 11 are arranged in 22 lines, exactly the number of lines as there are letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And do you remember the day we discovered this?
Oh, yes. And the very idea that it had 22 clicked for us because we have done such a prolonged study in the Hebrew alphabet and published the book, The Mystery of the Menorah and the Hebrew Alphabet, wherein we went through very meticulously the meanings of the letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And so we, of course, immediately instituted a program of study to study this Mezuzah. And Gary has found some really fascinating things in this. Gary, they are alphabetic, aren't they?
They are alphabetic, and by the way, it's going to take us 2 broadcasts to go through this, but this Mezuzah has an alphabetic character on the front of it, the letter Sheen, which stands for Shaddai, God the provider, and this is a recognition that he provides for this household. But as the Jews teach, that Shaddai is spelled with 3 Hebrew letters. It's spelled Shin, Dalet, Yot. The Shin, Dalet, Yot are an acronym for Shomer Daltot Yisrael, watchman over the gates of Israel. And so this acknowledges God as a watchman and as a provider over every doorpost or mezuzah of the house of David. And I think this is very, very good. And it begins with the scripture, "Hear, O Israel." And as it reads in the King James Version of the Bible, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love." And it stops right there.
That's line one.
That's line one of the
That's
mezuzah.
the Aleph.
That's the Aleph. Now, it's, you
The first letter of the Hebrew alphabet.
First letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And what's fascinating is that these 22 lines have been broken up for centuries in a different versification than we find in our traditional Bibles. They are divided differently, and this gives them a slightly different slant or meaning. And we start with the Aleph, letter 1, line 1. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." Well, J.R., this so attaches to the meaning of the Aleph itself.
The Aleph refers to God, who is the head of all creation. And it introduces the Lord as God, as one God, because the Aleph is the number one.
That's right.
As well. And the fact that thou shalt love the Lord is also a part of the Aleph. It stands for the whole of the alphabet wrapped up into this one thing. In other words, everything revolves around God, who made all things.
And the Lord our God is one Lord. In Hebrew, it's Yahweh Echad. That means the word Echad is the word that means one in Hebrew, and it begins with the letter Aleph. And I think it's fascinating that when you place this on your doorpost, if you are an observant Jew, you will tack this up with the little scroll rolled up inside of it, and you will recite the following blessing. "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us by his commandments and commanded us to affix a mezuzah." That being the Hebrew word for doorpost. And of course, in Deuteronomy 6:9, it says, "And thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house." So it is a commandment which is followed to this very day.
One of the interesting things about the introductory verse of the mezuzah is the term, "Hear, O Israel." And the idea of hearing here is a spiritual hearing.
Yes.
And especially important because of the Song of Moses, wherein Israel's spiritual hearing was incarcerated under the law. But this also says that when man was first created, before the fall, man had the ability to hear the voice of God.
Oh, yeah. And also, it should be noted, and again, we're reading line 1 of the mezuzah, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love." It stops right there. And you know, Jesus said that all of the commandments could be broken into 2 parts. Love the Lord, love your fellow man.
Yes.
Well, we see part 1 right here.
And part 2 begins also in that second section in Deuteronomy chapter 11. So we have both parts of all the law and the prophets wrapped up right here in these 22 lines, these 170 words. We're going to get into the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet and the second line of the mezuzah when we return in just a moment. Don't go away. The mezuzah on every Jewish home contains 22 lines of scripture, conforming to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and their meanings. We have looked at the first line, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love." That's the Aleph. The second line deals with the bait. Gary, tell us about it.
Bait, the letter of the house. Now we're going to go through, on today's program, we won't have time to cover but the first 6 letters, Aleph through Vav, and that is, by the way, section 1 of the mezuzah text, which is called the Shema, "Hear, O Israel." The second section, beginning in Deuteronomy 11:13, it begins with the word Vahaya, "and it shall come to pass." It's prophetic, and we'll get to it next time.
And we'll have to wait a week, won't we?
Yes, we'll have to
That's
wait a week.
prophetic. It will come to pass.
But the break is after the 6th letter, and we're going to be talking
Yes.
about that too. Now, when we get to the letter Beit, it is line 2 of the mezuzah text. And it says, and it begins in the middle of a sentence, the Lord thy God with all thine heart, with all thy soul, with all thy might, and. And that,
that's it.
That's it. It's
That's
broken.
the line.
That's the line. Now, J.R., this is bait, the letter of the house. It's the letter of creation, really. It's the first word in the Bible begins with a bait, bereshit. God created. And it has to do
And
with
what he created was a house.
Was a house for
or a
man.
dwelling place.
That's right.
Okay.
And then in a smaller sense, it's the temple, which was the Beis HaMikdash, the holy temple, the holy house. And then on a smaller scale yet, it is the body. Our body is the temple of the Lord. And of course, this is one of the creeds of the Christian faith.
Yes, that's where we live.
It's where we live, in the house of God.
So the words, the Lord thy God with all thine heart and with all thy soul, that's the house.
The house.
That's the dwelling place where we dwell. And so we should love God with all of our heart and soul and all of our might and. Which is a conjunction that ties it into, it goes right straight through from the aleph to the beit to the gimel.
Gimel.
These words.
And gimel is the Hebrew letter for the number 3, but it's also the number that has the letter for a very specific kind of meaning, and it typifies loving kindness. Here's line 3. These words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently. Gimel. Now, Gimel is the letter that symbolizes two qualities. It symbolizes God's loving kindness, but also the idea of culmination. That is, he who hath begun a good work in you. The idea of the work being started and then being seen through to completion.
Like planting a seed.
Planting a seed.
And watching it grow up for the harvest. Now it's interesting that he says here, it shall be in thine heart, because that's where we love. So the idea that God's commandments will be in our hearts means that we shall love these commandments. We shall love the Lord with all our heart, soul, mind, and might, and love his commandments, these words, which I command thee. So we have the gimel, the loving kindness here in line 3.
Now I think it's very interesting that we're talking about verses from the Torah here, and yet the phraseology of these words is not legalistic, if you will, so much as it is a command to love. Jesus later came and expounded upon these qualities.
Are you talking about the difference between grace and law here?
Oh, I certainly am, J.R.
Expand on that.
Well, you know, the law condemns.
Yeah.
The law says you've done wrong and you shall pay. Grace, on the other hand, rehabilitates. Grace takes the sinner and lifts him up, places him on the rock, and makes a new man out of him. And that's the difference between law and grace.
It's like hate and love, isn't it?
It's very much like hate versus love. It's condemnation versus rehabilitation or lifting up. And by the way, the gimel is, we might call it the letter of loving kindness. Chesed is the Jewish word. It means, the English translation is grace. To be lifted up even though you don't deserve to be lifted up.
When we come to this 4th line, this really hits home.
Oh, this
for
one
me.
is rich.
This is the Dalet.
The letter Dalet, 4th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and the Dalet symbolizes the door or the pathway. And of course that pathway is the pathway of righteousness, which we must walk.
Is there a way, a pathway in this line?
There is a pathway in this line. Here's the Dalet line. Unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house and when thou walkest by the way.
Oh,
there it is.
My. So you see, it is so plain.
Yes, it is.
It's not difficult to determine the meanings of these lines and the symbolism of the letters of the alphabet here as it is laid out.
The Jews teach that the Dalet stands for the Delet, which is the door, and the Derek, which is the way, both of which begin with the letter Dalet. And we have those here in the 4th line.
When we come to the 5th line, we have the Hey. And what I feel is one of the really profound teachings of the mezuzah.
This is quite profound. He being the letter that has a divine or spiritual dimension, literally is the letter of the Spirit. We'll talk about that in a moment. Here's the line. Line 5, He. And when thou liest down, and when thou risest up, and thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as frontlets. That's the end of line 5.
So we have the He here in the Spirit. And to me, the time when we can commune with the Spirit is when we lie down at night and resting at night and put our minds in somewhat of a dream state. And the Lord is allowed then, through the Scriptures, it is proven that God comes to His prophets in dreams and visions. And so we have here this, shall we say, the alpha state, for lack of a better terminology, when the Spirit can speak.
Kind of a meditative state, we could call it. Meditation upon the things of the Lord, when you lie down, when you rise up. And now you bind these words for a sign on your hand. That means to act out the things of the Lord, to use your hand to do the work of the Lord, and as frontlets. Well, you know, the Word was also bound in a little box, tefillin, that hung right between the eyes. And we're going to get into that in the next line, because there's a break here that stops with frontlets, and I think that's very significant.
Which brings us to the 6th line, and the vav, between thine eyes. So that pinpoints it.
Yeah, the 6th line starts with the letter vav, which is the number 6 in Hebrew, and this letter is very, very special indeed. This ends section 1 of the mezuzah text. Here's line 6, between thine eyes. And thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house and on thy gates. Now this is fascinating, J.R., because we're talking about something between the eyes. Now if I do this, what am I doing?
You're pointing to the Holy of Holies, where we live and where God lives.
That's right.
For the Christian.
And interestingly enough, Vav, the 6th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, is the symbol of completion, redemption, and transformation. The idea of transformation means that through grace, God can take a lowly sinner, transform him into a tzaddik, a holy, righteous man, justified and ready to go before the Lord. Right. And this is a change or transformation that takes place in the Holy of Holies, between the eyes.
Or some have said the third eye.
Yeah, the Orientals would speak of that as the third eye. But
and this vav here, being 6, is the number of man. And the vav represents our connection between man and God. And when men fell, the vav disappeared out of the word generations, the toledot of the first chapters of Genesis. We have, in the first use of the word generations, we have a vav, 2 vavs. In the second, we have one of those vavs missing, which refers to a break in the connection between man and God. And Gary, that's where the break comes between these 2 sections. We skip all the way to chapter 11 of Deuteronomy for the next section, and the Zayin. So we have a break here between the 6 and the 7. That's the break between man and God, isn't it?
That's right. And we end now with the vav that says, between thine eyes. Read the New Testament verse that corresponds to this, because I think it's great.
In Romans chapter 12, verse 2, Paul writes, and be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind.
And that transformation is the very meaning of the letter Vav.
The interesting thing here is the Zayin is the 7th. That could represent the 7th millennium. Something's going to happen, but at the end of the 6th and just before the 7th millennium, and it says, and it shall come to pass. We'll get into that on our next program.